So, obviously, this is kind of a funny angle, and you're just gonna have to forgive it so that I can do landscape mode, and you'll just, deal with this, and I'll hide myself a little bit. Today, I want to talk about mental causal power, or manifestation, or the law of attraction in idealism. Now, before I talk about that, let me just clarify that I am painfully aware of the cringification of the entire concept. I'm very aware of I'm very aware of the negative association and connotations people have with it, and I understand that that would make anyone who wants to take philosophy or metaphysics seriously to veer away from that. However, at the end of the day, that's not an argument. And if we're idealists, if you're an idealist, especially if you're a monist or monistic idealist, it's certainly, something that should be addressed because, you know, it basically posits that corporeality isn't a principle in itself. It's really something else, or has to exist in the context of something else. So if corporeality is emergent from an infotheoretic origin, it seems like there really might be some way in which mental causal power does exist. Are we really going to, arbitrarily bar minds from accessing this set of information in the mind that is rendered by minds? Are we going to reify it such that, reality is extremely deterministic and mechanical, and that materiality might as well just be a direct emanation, the precise way that it is, from, then it would be basically like neutral monism at best. But that doesn't really make sense, because then particularity and plurality would be just as fundamental as unity. And in a certain sense, Platonists kind of argue for that, but we're not going to talk about that exactly right now. I think syndiphonesis would be like a difficult argument to overcome for that. More so, what I want to talk about, maybe I'll make a case for mental causal power, but I think a pressing and interesting thing to talk about is why it's not as apparent as you might think. And if it were true, there would have to be a very good reason for why it's not as apparent. Some people might think it is very apparent, and I think that, that shouldn't be dismissed either. But we could even say why it isn't apparent in the way you might expect from what's predicated. And I think there is a good reason for this. And I think it has to do with the scale. Maybe scale is not the best word, but we'll say scale at which the human mind exists. In order to explain that, we have to understand like how particulars arise out of universals, which is kind of like, well, we have to bear in mind that more specified sets of information need more general sets of information as their baseline to be specified from. And specified ones are more composite. So that's one part of the puzzle, but it doesn't actually answer the question of why it's not as apparent as we might expect it to be. But the other thing, we're going to have to get into gender in metaphysics, not like, this isn't, we're not going to talk gender theory, obviously. Well, actually, yeah, we are, but in a cool way. And how creation happens, and the way we're gonna have to talk about that, and we're also gonna have to talk about nous, in the Platonic sense. So let's talk about gender. Gender means to bring forward, So the principle of gender is basically a reproductive principle. And sex, the sexes are the poles of gender that are incurred such that the process can happen. And now we're going to talk about nous. This is how I think that the polarization between, male and female, or, what we observe as male and female, is rooted in the polarization of masculine and feminine. And what nous is basically subject distinct from object and the subject looking at its own object. And this is why Plotinus says that nous, or intelligence, if it was, usually it's translated into intelligence. So if you've read the Iliads, usually nous doesn't appear a whole ton unless they use some Greek terms. But we're going to say nous. Plotinus says that nous is not the first principle because there is an implicit duality. And what I think this duality is a virtual duality between the subject and its object. And what I mean by this is the thing that is and the way that it is. There's no reason fundamentally why those two things are not actually one. Why fundamentally the one is not isomorphic to the other. So the first principle, the primary reality principle as I see it, they'd be completely the same, and any distinction between the two would be completely virtual, not actual, not real. But that does not preclude the subject looking at its object, especially if what it is in some way a mind. Grant me a little bit of like colloquial use here, especially if you're a Platonist, okay? Descriptive use, all right? We could talk about, we could debate that some other time. When the subject looks at its own object, you have this immediate introduction of a virtual distinction, because now you have an observer and an observed. Even if it's the same thing, we have a virtual distinction. This is why idealism makes a lot of sense, because this kind of virtualization, it reminds us of thinking, especially, when we think of how corporeality would be associated with this, but we're not quite there yet. So we have this virtual distinction. We kind of have a dyad. And let's clarify, how a dyad should be understood in this context. The dyad, a system of two, should be composed of the virtually distincted, primary principle, the monad, that's in the dyad, and then the dyad in the dyad. The one and the two in the two. And then when they interact, you get a three. And if you've seen the Pythagorean source books diagrams on dyad and the triad, this will be easier to understand, because in the diagram of the triad, you have this central circle, right, that's intersecting the two dyad circles, right? It's right in the center of them. So it's almost like the monad that's on the outside. The monad is like on the outside of the dyad, and also like one of the circles on the inside. Think of it like that. And then the triad is reproduced. It's almost like the monad being reproduced in the dyad, or because of the dyad. So because there is a 1 and 2 in the 2, you get the 3, right? Kind of interesting. 1 is the basis of enumeration. The Pythagoreans didn't really think 1 was a number in the sense. Too tangential. I apologize. In any case, this is kind of a lot to tie into where I want it to go, so you kind of have to bear with me. But we have this principle of gender. We have a virtual distinction at the most universal scale, right? This is the baseline for virtuality. But it follows that increasing particularity and specification would be, well, let's say particularity would be concomitant with plurality as this enumeration continues. More specific sets of information would be composed of more general sets of information. So humans are involved with very, very, very specific sets of information. We're very down the ladder, so to speak. Maybe not at the bottom of it. It's hard to know, but we are minds that are involved with and saturated with very specific sets of information. And the more defined a set of information is, not only the more composite it is, I just pulled my hair. Not only the more composite it is, but the more relative it is to that which it is not, because there is more that it isn't. And, you know, definition incurs relation. Because if you have something defined, you have what is more similar to it, you have what is more different, it is relative to what it isn't, like I just said, to what it is, and that's graded. So we inhabit a very relative, very defined scale of this process. And now, I don't know if I already said this, I don't think I did, but I'm going to describe a position I have in that the conscious mind is in the domain of the monad, or the directive principle, the masculine principle, and the subconscious mind. These aren't perfect terms for this, but grant some, colloquial space, some descriptive space, okay? Because you'll probably be able to understand what I mean. The subconscious is in the domain of the feminine principle. Think of how creative it is. Think of like any mental process, even like somatic processes. They're very creative and they happen beneath the surface of consciousness. Consciousness is agential, it's directive. Think of dreams, think of daydreaming, think of like how intrusive the subconscious mind can be with just generating stuff when you try to meditate or whatever, right? Now, because we inhabit such a particular plural, like composite scale or level of this process, we inhabit a greater degree of reified distinction between the two poles that create, that interact with each other to create. If the masculine and feminine, the interaction, the intercourse between them is what creates information, I guess virtualizes information, it's not really adding anything to the Godhead, right? It's not adding anything, ontological to the absolute. So I don't mean it in that sense. But it's if that's what creates virtual information, that's the baseline of it. And at that level, it's less reified. And at this level, it's more, because we're more composite, we're more reified. There's more object conditions reified, is what I mean by that. We're more involved with them. Then it makes perfect sense that the masculine and feminine, or we'll say the conscious and subconscious mind, would not be interacting at such an intensity to make this like idealistic emergence of corporeal happenstance as apparent, right? It wouldn't be as powerful. You can't, like, you thinking of something does not like manifest it right before your eyes, unless you're like a level 20 mage. Maybe you are, you specifically watching this, you probably are. Whereas a higher scale being, that might actually be the case, but we also shouldn't like pretend to understand exactly how like a being might operate at a universal condition, because we're probably going to bring our own assumptions about how beings operate from a very particular scale, which is what we do. Very PD, okay? Ogenous guys, please forgive that. Now, let's see. That's basically that. Because we operate at a more particularized level of information saturating the mind. Let me just clarify that I think that corporeality emerges from an infotheoretic origin that's in the mind, and the mind prepossesses a capacity to retain information in the sense of a metastructure, retaining structures, posterior structures, and that corporeality is actually the process of the mind looking at that object and rendering the information to itself. And the reason that makes sense is because information is defined, definition is always relative. So time and space, well, space specifically right now makes perfect sense. You would experience a body, you would experience spatiality because you would have, well, with individuated minds nestled into universal minds, you would have a body because you would have what's defining, the information you're more directly involved with, and then the information that it's relative with. So you would inhabit a world, you would experience and interact with other individuated agents. This makes perfect sense. And time would be basically the sequencing of this, which, because there's agency changing, looking through the contents, changing what it's focusing on or where its attention is going, this also makes sense. So I kind of gave a, cursory argument for mental causal power too, but this is why I think it's less obvious, but I also want you to think about some implications of what I'm saying, in the sense of, if you were to more effectively kind of unite, think of, if creation happens, this is what we observe phenomenally. Creation emerges from an interaction, a unison between the masculine and feminine principles. The more effectively you can do this, the more effectively you can exercise this natural law, which I think is true, obviously. And I think it is a natural conclusion from idealism. Maybe you have a better argument as to why that's not the case. I don't think it's as fantastical as it may sound. As I said, we are minds operating at a very particular level, so there is a bigger virtual gap between the subject and the object, so you thinking doesn't project, something out there, or doesn't like rearrange the information beneath space-time in such and such a way. Nonetheless, it can still be true in some degree, and there can still be a specific operation or way to do this effectively. And I think gender, understanding that process, this creative process, and the interaction between the directive and creative principles would be the way to do that. So let me know what you think. Share the video if you're feeling so kind. Subscribe to the channel. I feel like I'm giving you a bit of a chore list here. Maybe I should stick to one request per video. I do have a website blog type thing, arsphilosophica.com. Do one of those. How about, hey, do one of those things. Also, let me know what I should talk about. And if you're interested in joining a group chat to talk about metaphysics with me and other people, then DM me on Telegram or Instagram or something at metamundanity, or Twitter at metamundanity. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.